Ngihtaachiimwi. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to NEEKAAWA, KIHTAACHIIMUWAK, WULAAKWUNUWII. This evening, they tell stories. There's going to be three stories that are going to be shared this evening that originate from Munsee Delaware Nation. And these stories came from the community. And for those that aren't familiar with Munsee Delaware, it's a small reserve that's located on the Thames River, just about 35 minutes southwest of London, Ontario. So this is sort of like a premiere, and I must admit there was a little hesitancy, but it's getting close to being well, it's much more completed on Katherine than my end. So Katherine whips me into shape at times when it comes to this story. So this is a really wonderful story that is also from the Logan family. It is a blend of fiction and nonfiction. And what I thought tonight is that myself and Katherine could share the very beginnings of the story without giving way too much of it away, because it still needs to be finished, but it's also it's out for review for publication. So it's going much further than being put together at Staples and things like that. This has a much different audience in mind. So the story's working title is Ngihtaachiimwi, which means I tell a story. And that's a working title of the story. So the story is about my great uncle, Arnold Logan. And Arnold Logan was born he was born in 1896. He comes from a family of four, and he has a half brother as well. He's born on Munsee, Delaware. And that's a photo of him prior to 1913. It could be 1914, not too sure. But he has quite a remarkable life. Next slide. In 1914, Arnold joins. I have to minimize my screen here. There we go. Arnold joins the Canadian Expeditionary Force in St. Thomas, Ontario, and that, while might not appear like a big deal, because in Canada there was close to 100,000 soldiers or men that signed up, women signed up for war in the First World War. He is one of the very first Indigenous people to sign up. And to give context, here in Canada, Indigenous people couldn't sign up for World War I. So it was not, they didn't actively solicit Indigenous people to fight in World War I. So there's, between he and a very famous sniper named Francis Pegamagabo, they are two people who signed up within days of war being declared in 1914. So there is a picture of him. We actually were able to narrow down his actual picture in the group photo. The group photo is an interesting piece because that's going to be the sort of the start of the story. But Arnold is there pictured. He's got his pith helmet. Looks like he's got a ribbon on his shirt that I think they pinned on him because he was one of what was called the first 100, first 100 from Elgin County to sign up. And I gather that one of the very first places in Ontario where they actually they took recruits. There is some things you're going to notice about this story. So what I've done is I've given out, or I've offered the rough draft version of the story this evening. So there's a much better draft in terms of my language work. So you may notice that there's some spelling issues, that there may be some things that need to be changed. I certainly do. So I'm looking at it and going, boy, this was written a long time ago. And you heard Katherine said, well, I did this artwork quite a long time ago. So you notice where you've come from and where you're going in terms of language working. The picture is outside of the Elgin County Courthouse, which is still there in St. Thomas. So, I mean, the photo could, I guess, be recreated, but this is a story a brief story of Arnold. Before I read it too, I'll share that the story itself is a balance of research of what we could find out about Arnold through paper, photos, newspaper clippings, war records. There's a blend of family story as well. So what was talked about in my own family, but there's also other people's families because he was good friends with many people that he worked on the railway with. And we solicited those families for memories or anything that their relatives would have said about him. He only lived to be 19, so he was still a teenager when he died. He has a statue of him out on the reserve, rather large statue. It's like many of the war memorials that you'll see commemorating World War I, where there's a tall statue on top of a soldier. And the thing that I always questioned when I was younger was we don't really give out a lot of statues to honor teenagers. And we don't, certainly there aren't a lot of statues that honor Indigenous teenagers. And there's not a lot of statues that honor Indigenous war veterans, at least here in Ontario and in Canada. So this statue was always a puzzlement to me. This story, and I'm glad Katherine is illustrating because I've really appreciated how much she does when it comes to the artwork and bringing stories alive. This story has been with me since I was in OAC, grade 13, right? When I was posed with a history project of saying, okay, you can do anything you want, but you have to go into a deep dive of study about something, and you have to create a 3D model. So I'm a terrible artist. I'm terrible with my hands in terms of creating something. So I created this puny little tombstone with this figurine on top. And it wasn't worth a whole lot when it came to a 3D art display, but the research and the things that I learned was incredible. And as a teacher, I'm always mindful that, hey, you know what? I may have really not done very well with the whole goal of create this wonderful statue. And, I've created the Mona Lisa or Leonardo da Vinci's hands or mine. But boy, did I learn a ton in terms of research. And that was back in the pre-computer days where I actually had to go to the archives to find stuff, or I had to buy a book to find stuff, or I had to interview family members. That kind of thing, oftentimes people won't get a chance to do anymore because, of course, we can just Google it, right? What does Wikipedia say? So this has been with me since, well, I don't know, 19, so I did 31 years ago. It's 31 years of living with Arnold's story and finding out new bits and pieces, and then finding a wonderful artist to actually bring the story to life. So I'm really thrilled. You can probably hear it in my voice. And what I'll do now is I won't be quiet. I'll read the Munsee language and share that piece. So Nina when he wihin kwet katwak hikanong ni namshala shocho latechan kashalanda nin mata walama. Nuichi po lunawak pokwik kapan nawalomwa NEEKAAWA no wundap ponawa ala wundawan quish quick ton hawina Aland Nafamawa Alkanima Josmuk Wak no Kokwa Al English song. The English in this, if we go back a slide, you can see I'm doing this to myself. So part of writing this story, I'm trying to write in English as they would have talked in English at the time. So there's a lot of research in terms of reading newspaper articles, reading books of the time to get a sense of the literary ways in which people communicated in the English language. So you can see that I'm putting a lot more difficulty on myself when it comes to translating into Munsee, because I'm talking in an early 1900s Southern Ontario English. So making my life a little bit more harder. Ngihtaachiimwi tawapo Ngihtaachiimwi shihsuwanakuw Namawi tali kanjachiimuw laachumohkawaat. Nalahii Lunaape Arnold Nalahii na Ngihtaachiimwi apchinala kermarkat nindalog nishwakatam anjum makala social tasich apukwichen dahikan kalamasayan wikwam inonjaini St. Thomas shuk matayani takhi ni nawalas panach tika. And I think that's the last slide for this story. Another piece that's really important, St. Thomas was a railway hub. I think it's still called the railway city, even though they only have one railway go to it now, which goes to Fort Stanley. However, at the turn of the century, and when Arnold lived in St. Thomas, it was a railway mecca. So anybody and everybody worked on the railway. It was that way when I was a kid. And everybody had a nickname. So I think there's a close collegiality when it comes to working on the railway. He was a fireman, which was the worst job, but I guess that was the entry-level job where you had to shovel coal into the locomotive. So it's a very dirty, very sweaty, and not a very appealing job. But I gather from my other relatives, my great-grandfather, that was sort of the entry job, and other members of my family ended up being engineers on the railway, which I think is quite a remarkable feat for Indigenous people working in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that they got to that high point in their careers. Maybe what I'll do is I'm going to be quiet and pass it over to Katherine, because her artwork's very exciting.
Thank you so much. I feel like this has just been like such a long process, and it really resonates with me what you said about the work sort of being a living document. I think there's very much an inclination on my part with a lot of the early work that I've done for this, because I believe I've been working on it since I was around 16, 17, and I'm 19 now. There's sort of an inclination to be like, oh my God, what was I thinking? There's so many things that I can improve with this. But I feel as if it's, obviously, like just sitting with your work for that long is really difficult, because you just like notice the smallest things. But I think it's just, I don't know, I think it's a testament to the way the work sort of evolves, and this natural evolution that occurs while you're working on something like this. And I think it's a very exciting process, and I think I should, I have been sort of teaching myself in that instance to react with joy when I see something that I could have done better, that I would be able to do better with my artistic skills now versus a few years ago. There's so much improvement, and there's so much process that's held in this story, and I think it's so incredibly special, and I'm incredibly excited for what's to come of it. I think, you know, during the illustration process, spending so much time with this story, I've very much like come to know Arnold Logan, and I don't know. I think it's a very interesting connection, because obviously I'm just communicating with this person through historical records and through assumptions of, you know, where he had been, what he had been doing. A lot of the story has to be, well, we don't know for sure what he was doing at this point, but we have to assume that this is what was happening. And I think a lot of his letters are just very, I think they very much speak to the time, and I think they very much speak to the way, you know, Indigenous people were treated at the time. And I did talk a little bit about this more extensively on the podcast, but I wonder if I could word it better, because I've it's a more appropriate time of day for me to be able to formulate thoughts. But the way he speaks about a lot of the oppression he faces, and a lot of the really, really tragic events that have occurred in his life is very nonchalant, and very, well, you know, this is just the way things are. And I think it's incredibly emotional to read years and years later, when obviously so much has changed, but there's still so much progress to be made in terms of Indigenous rights, in terms of the reclamation of the language and the culture. I think that there are a lot of emotions in terms of, well, I wish I could go back, and I wish I could actually genuinely communicate with this person how much progress his community is making, and how celebrated he is in this way. But I also know that, like, a lot of you know, a lot of the ways that the community operates now, and a lot of the ways that even like the structures, the formal Western structures within Canada operate now, would be very shocking to someone at the time. So it's sort of reconciling those feelings of how to bridge that gap between this person and you know, myself in the modern time.
Forgot to mention that it was a reach out. I think Catherine had done a few books for me prior to, and I said, well, can you do a graphic novel? So it was like a rather large out of the blue ask, because I thought I was trying to think of ways in which this book could live. So initially I sort of thought that this would be something that could appeal to, I mean, the story has to appeal because it's a very it's an Indigenous veteran who wasn't actually, if the rules had been enforced, he would never be there. But also, would it have appeal for elementary school readers, or for those to, you know, support Indigenous courses here in Ontario? I think that this story is of just as importance as Francis' story, the famous sniper, where you have, you know, two Indigenous people who signed up right away. And you know, I feel like this story needs to be just as much. You know, an interesting thing that the statue is actually put up by his colleagues on the railway, which he only worked with them for a year and a half. And you know, this is something that I think Catherine has really gotten through her artwork, is that this guy was really well loved by everybody. He was kind of the guy who, like, nobody had a qualm with. And she's done a great future other pieces of artwork within the story to try and get that across, that this guy was so well loved that they dedicated a statue of him after he passed. And that's no small feat and no small expense, especially during a war.
Mm-hmm. I do want to add that when you reached out to me initially, I think my response was that, like, I've never done that before, but I can, I'd love to. I just think it's such an interesting like collaboration that we've built up over the years. It's just like, would you like to try this? And I'm like, yeah, I'm glad you trust me to do it.
The story's in good hands.
I hope so. Thank you so much. That's very kind.
Are you ready to go to a couple questions, Ian?
Sure.
There's one sort of fact-oriented question. One person was asking, I think it was B. Sean was asking, what happened to Arnold? You mentioned he passed at a young age. I don't know if that's going to be part of his story. And also Rick Kitchen shared a link to the YouTube Remembering Private Arnold Logan Remembrance Day Lecture 2021.
Yeah, that was a fun one because I got to go back to a university that really wasn't a place where you flew the flag that you were Indigenous back in the early 1990s, to being invited back to talk about this particular relative of mine with another relative of mine who's Indigenous, which was wonderful, right? So you're in this very Western education space, but you're talking about someone who like Katherine mentioned, went through a lot of different things in his lifetime to try and buck the system, I guess, right, in order to do what he wanted to do while pushing the boundaries of the Indian Act. So yeah, no, Arnold died during the war. I won't go into it because that's part of our story that you'll just have to wait for the book.
It's yet to be told.
That's right.
I just want to make a comment. I was really struck when Katherine was talking about the ways in which she had felt almost like she'd come to know. She says, "I've come to know Arnold Logan," and that really resonated in my mind with the title you've given the story, Ian, Ngihtaachiimwi. And that's from the word to tell a great story, but it's I tell a great story, like it's him speaking his own story. And I wondered if that was something either or both of you wanted to reflect on a little bit. It resonates too with something you said at the very beginning, Ian, where you said, you don't label these stories as, your individual authorial work, but rather coming from the community. I wonder if that's something that the title of this story brings out as well.
I think so, like from my end, because this is like I said, 31 years, 32 years of getting to know this fellow, and there's new things that you find out all the time. Despite the stories that you learned as a kid, despite what was told, you saw his medals, relatives heard little bits and pieces. But I think, I guess that's one good thing about the new era, is that you're open to a wealth of new materials, so you get to know this fellow even more. And I can't stress enough that he only lived to be 19, so you're working with a very narrow window of information, and yet you really get a sense of who this guy was. And you can I don't know if Katherine feels the same way, but you get a sense as to why people really liked him. I don't know, without even like shaking the guy's hand or even people telling you that that's why people liked him. I don't know. That's how I've come to 32 years of thinking about it.
Would you like to add, Katherine?
Yeah, I was just about to say I completely understand what Ian's getting at. I feel like there's this kindness and this openness and this joyfulness which sort of transcends cultures, languages, all of that. I just think it's very, I don't know, I feel like it's not that he never is upset, never complains. He, of course, like lived during a very difficult time and fought in a very difficult war. There are a lot of like letters that we've like gone through and a lot of commentary that Ian's provided where of course like he's upset about the events that are happening, but at the same time there's just sort of this attitude towards other people that's incredibly kind, for the hardships that he's been through, and incredibly helpful, and good spirited. And I just think that I think that's very aspirational. And I think it's really incredible that he is sort of this figure and that we are able to honor him in this way by telling his story and illustrating his story. It's also like, I think something to note that like when he passed, he was the same age as me, which I feel also sort of deepens my connection with the subject matter and deepens my connection with him as a person, because, you know, like reading through all of this, he could have been my classmate had he like lived in a different time. He could have you know, but in his second year of university, he could have been second or first year of university, he could have been you know, my peer. And I just think it's very resonant because it's this connection between two people who, if not for the time between them, could have been friends. Or at least I would hope so. But yeah, I just think it's a very incredible, indescribable feeling to be able to work on this and to be able to work with not only Ian but also Arnold.
Those are good words. A couple more comments from the chat. Molly Miller commented, she said, we have some stories, and I think she's talking about the Stockbridge Munsee community that can be interpreted into Munsee. And I like the language she's using to interpret it into, like the things that change as you bring them over. I don't know if you want to comment a little bit on that, Ian.
Is there something in the chat that's specific, Suzanne, or just in terms of?
She did. It's just tantalizing. She just sort of left it.
Oh, that there are stories to translate.
Uh-huh.
Oh, geez. You know,
She's got the bait, dangling the bait in front of you.
I have to focus. I have to get this story done. Otherwise, I'm like, it's because, yeah, this, you can never say no, but I have John's story to finish, and I need to finish Arnold's story for some pretty serious deadlines. So, but once that clears within the year, I can entertain things like that. Yes. And Nishik, Molly.
Something to look forward to. There's another question that actually kind of raises something that's come out a little bit already about the sound, how Munsee language sounds, and maybe comparing it to other languages. So here, this is Robin has said, I have a Cherokee friend who taught me some Cherokee, and I've noticed that both languages, Munsee and Cherokee, are beautiful. Cherokee words seem to be shorter and guttural sounding. The Munsee language seems to use longer words, which sounds lyrical to me. And Robin goes on to say, do you think the purpose of the Munsee language is to have a musical, lyrical connection? I wondered if you, because of your experience in hearing other languages that are spoken in Southwestern Ontario, wonder if that's something you'd like to comment on, whether it's languages in the same family or not. What's maybe special or particular about Munsee language as we hear it and, you know, take it in with our ear as well as hear with our eye?
Well, I think it's sort of a safe place where I can say, I think what I've been told is that the Munsee language is the grandfather of the Algonquin languages. So that's Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Odawa, Mi'kmaq, Abenaki. There's a wide range of languages that are, I think, what we would call as we are the root language. And linguists, people that deal with that are much more expressive than I am. When it comes to learning languages, I've learned all three in bits and pieces over my lifetime. I found the Haudenosaunee language is very hard to learn because of the way that it's written through orthography. So the symbols that represent guttural sounds or nasal sounds are very tricky for me, especially with the Oneida language, which I learned because I wanted to know what the kids were saying behind my back at the recess. And then the Ojibwe language, where, you know, from learning from people at Rama or Christian Island, it's more closer to the Munsee language. So I can understand the connections and how the two languages are related. So, and oftentimes it happens with Cree as well, where you can see, oh, those words are fairly similar, right? So you can almost see how this notion of Lenape as being the grandfather language would come about. Musically, I've never thought about that. I always think that, you better learn Munsee because when you leave this world, that's what they speak up there or wherever there is. So you got to learn that one first, then you can learn the other one after if you want. I find there's a flow, especially because, the second double vowel, you have to speak with an intonation, a little, emphasis on that. When it comes to, Haudenosaunee languages, they have their own way of doing that. And despite the fact that we have that X sound, I think that there's that, I don't know, I love the sound of the language, especially when it's spoken by people who can speak it better than I can.
Molly Miller added in the chat, we are told that our languages sound rhythmic. And I think here she's talking about Mohican and Munsee. She says, Lunaape is music to my ears. She says, it's a nice thing to say.
Yeah, they used to say, my uncle Skip used to say he dreamt in the language, right? So that was, that's another piece that transcends our, our normal waking hours. That is that's another piece where he heard the language.
Other comments are just expressions of appreciation. People are saying what a good way this is to spend an evening sharing these stories, and thanking you, Ian, and thanking Katherine for the presentation. I don't know if you want to close with some words.
You know what? It's I always appreciate these evenings because I get to get to work with Katherine, slide by slide. Also, we get sort of discuss about how, I guess it's not so much the isolation in terms of a language worker, and I think that's oftentimes how I can speak for myself. That's oftentimes how I feel, simply because I don't live on community. With the passing of Karen, I don't have that close person who I can text to in the language or call up and we can have a big conversation any longer. So the loss of a friend. So I value the opportunity to speak language as much and as able as I am, but also to talk about sort of getting over that, not that fear, but like sharing what you're doing. I think that's another critical piece. Like you got to share what's going on and share the process so that others can take up that, what is that expression? Take up that torch, right? So that's that next generation coming up, or inspire others. So I hope that's kind of what I've done, but I appreciate it. I appreciate having to put myself through the grinder in terms of actually speaking the language too for an extended part of time.
I think in terms of closing thoughts, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me for the second year in the row. It's always such an honor to be able to share this space and to be able to celebrate the language with you all. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to illustrate. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to attend these events. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share the language with so many people. It's just a really incredible experience. Thank you so much.
We've shared that recordings of last year's Munsee Delaware Story Night from last February, which includes readings by two of our speakers last year. If you go to that page and scroll down a little bit to last February, you'll see recordings there. So we'll just say Laachumohkawaat to everyone, and see you at the next event. We'll have events coming up in the course of the year, and then next February will be, I hope, the third annual story evening. Anishik, Ian, Anishik, Katherine.
Anishkwaachiimuwak. Ngihtaachiimwi.
Ngihtaachiimwi.